Hi, everybody. My name is Nicolas. I've been in the practice of strategic foresight for the past 17 years and so, in different forms, advising some of the world's biggest brands and how we can look at change and try to understand what is changing technology, our society, our values, in order to have a grasp on how the future might look like. How many of you are actually familiar with strategic foresight or practice some foresight practices in your daily life? Can you just raise your hand? Yeah, a few. Cool. So maybe it's a good idea to actually start with the premise of what is strategic foresight as a discipline. And I can talk a lot about that, but in a nutshell, we are referring to the discipline of making sense of emerging change, exploring its future implications, and use that new awareness to take better decisions today. So it's not about predicting the future, it's actually more about understanding change. What is growing, what is declining, what is transforming, what is being born, what's dying. Right? So it's not too much about having a crystal ball and try to make predictions about what the future will look like, but more about understanding change. And we have a lot of examples of companies that failed to understand change or underestimated change. Kodak invented the digital camera, but they put it on a shelf because they didn't believe that people wanted to take digital pictures, or they just wanted to protect their film business. Blockbuster had a chance to buy Netflix at some point, but they didn't understand the change in how people will consume content and the streaming revolution. Same with Nokia, was at some point the biggest communications company in the world, and they failed to understand the smartphone revolution, or Yahoo as well, who had a chance to buy Google for very little money at some point, but they also didn't understand how search was also changing and how behavior on the internet was changing. So there's a lot of examples on how certain technologies are misunderstood, or certain new behaviors are not being really understood either. And this is especially relevant today, where we are not just living in a multi-crisis world with multiple crises happening at the same time, political, economical, financial, environmental. We are actually living more on a permanent state of crisis. So we need to actually find ways of dealing with that, on dealing with the fact that crises are not going anywhere. If anything, they're going to get stronger and more complex, more interconnected because of the nature of our world today. Uncertainty is not the exception. We used to think that uncertainty was just a glitch in the matrix, but actually is the operating system where everything today is based: our societies, our work, our financial system. And yet we are expected to lead organizations, lead teams, and find exciting opportunities in this context that is constantly changing, right? So that tension is really interesting. How do we find interesting opportunities, especially with the strategy and investment perspective in a context that is constantly moving? We know that almost half of adults say that they feel more uncertain about the future than just 2 years ago. And many of them are already changing their behavior because of it, right? So we do it in our private lives, but then also this reflects in our organizations. We are changing our behavior when it comes to uncertainty. And this is not a new idea. Peter Drucker already in the 60s was talking about the idea that we need to learn to feel comfortable in uncertainty, to navigate uncertainty. But we believe that navigating uncertainty is not enough. We also need to actually learn to thrive in that uncertainty and use that uncertainty in our advantage. So this is why strategic foresight, or this practice of thinking about the future actively, systemically, and deeply, is extremely important if we want to remain relevant and resilient in this context. So I just wanted to share with you very briefly 3 of our key principles, and also when we work with certain organizations and how we can navigate these uncertain times, and of course with a small angle, a small perspective on investment strategy. And the first principle is that foresight, this idea about thinking about the future, must be collaborative. The future is too complex to just to do it alone. 12, 13, 14 years ago, I was hired to provide a lot of insights and reports to different companies, to different organizations. But I don't believe that that has too much value anymore, because there's so much information going on around that, we also need to, me as an expert, I can tell you a lot of things, but you and your people have a lot of the answers from within. Paul Virilio talked about this idea of dromology, this idea that we need to understand the speed of change, because of technology sometimes changes faster than our legislation, than our laws, even than our values. So we have a really hard time adapting to certain changes. And I think we can experience that and feel that in the conversations today when it comes to AI. Sometimes the development is so fast that we don't know, okay, how do I feel about this? Do we want to replace all our lawyers with machines? Have we had that conversation? Though I don't want to have any employees at all, though I only want to have AI agents, that becomes almost a philosophical discussion, right? So we need to understand what is the speed and the impact of that change. Especially today when we talk about AI, actually how big is that impact, that potential impact, and when is it happening? Is it in a 10-year horizon? Is it right now that it's happening? Change also can mean many, many different things. So we also need to understand, that change. And how do we capture that? We looked at something that is emerging. We look at the things that can, small things emerging in behaviors, in values, that can tell us something about what will be meaningful in the future. That's what we call signals of change, right? It's small, bits of, people doing things differently, believing things differently. If you think of 2008, I remember I was reading some articles of people that was traveling to the Caribbean and working remotely from their laptops. And that was, very few people that was able to do that, but that was a signal of change at that time of how work could potentially change, right? And right now, that is just another dimension of work. It didn't replace how we work 100%, but it added a new dimension, right? So we're looking at those things today. What are those emerging behaviors, new societal values that are changing? Of course, new technologies, new business models, consumer shifts, new regulations and policies. And that's why foresight must be collaborative. First, collaborating with technology, especially today for the tools that we have. This field has been revolutionized in the last 3 years, I would say, where we used to have a huge team of researchers that are doing a lot of investigations and looking for some of these trends and some of these emerging signals. And now a lot of that process has been, automated. And it's good enough, it's good enough to get to very valuable insights. We still need the expertise, certain expertise in certain areas, but certain tools today can give us a lot of volume, a lot of breadth, and also expose us to things that maybe we didn't know before. But as important as that, the collaboration with other humans is becoming even more important today, because that's the only way that we can ensure relevance, that we can ensure alignment, and also that we keep people engaged and motivated in the work. Just to give you a small example, we've been working for many years with Polar Orbis, which is a big beauty brand from Japan, cosmetic, kind of traditional hardcore cosmetics. And they've been very, very good at constantly asking themselves the question of what will be the future categories that will define the landscape of beauty in the coming years, right? So beyond creams, beyond facial treatments and things like that, what is that will define what is beautiful? What do we consider as beautiful? How technology is changing our perceptions of what is beautiful, etc. And of course, can they play a role there? Can they invest resources and energy in these new categories that are emerging? So with them, we've been doing a lot of conscious use of their internal collective intelligence. They have hundreds of very, very smart people, a lot of PhD students on anything from chemistry to biology to arts and culture. And we just ask them, what are you observing? What are the signals that you are observing in your organization that we should know of? And some come with some new technology that emerged or some new research paper that was, developed. Some come with something they observed their grandma doing or their kids doing. And slowly we start creating a picture of all of these different changes, of all of these signals. We have our own tools that we use to do that, where we can create, assisted by, of course, technology and AI, kind of that can help us with, hey, here are 10 really interesting things that we should know about beauty, or you can add it yourself if you are an expert on that field. But the idea is to generate and visualize this common truth, because when we do that, we can actually have really interesting conversations, because it doesn't become about finding what's right or wrong, but rather getting a big picture of what is changing in our landscape. So technology gives us volume and breadth, but human reflection is what actually gives us meaning in our organizations. The second principle has to do with, instead of doing predictions, actually focusing on developing landscapes and understanding the complexity of how our present is evolving. This is important because the future is a constantly moving target. Our image of how the future might look like already changed in the last 2 weeks with the new conflicts. There's a new conflict coming up. There's a new technology developing every day almost. So our idea of the future is constantly moving, is constantly changing. And the traditional approach to doing this has been, doing a lot of reports, trend reports. Hey, these are the 10 trends you should follow next year. This is what will define this certain field, this certain industry. And that's really good. It's really important to do that. But also, it's becoming a little bit obsolete very quickly. It's a little bit static and doesn't really give us the nuances that sometimes reality actually has. So it's a little bit like looking into, the weather and saying, okay, it's going to be sunny or it's going to be cloudy today, versus looking at the radar version of the weather app, right? When I can see, oh, there's a cloud here, so maybe I only have 1 hour to take a run before it actually start pouring. And this becomes quite valuable because it shapes my behavior. The other one is still important because it gives me awareness, but this kind of live view on things shapes my behavior and how I take decisions. So we want to move from being just reactive organizations into being more anticipatory, right? So actually we are proactive in that change and using that change to our advantage. With this Japanese company that I was talking about before, we've done a lot of just mapping of what is the landscape of beauty happening, right? We've done a lot of projects around how certain emerging cultures are defining the beauty industry from areas that have nothing to do with the beauty industry. For instance, we did a lot of research around microbiome 7-8 years ago. They were very curious about, how that culture of people doing kombucha at home and all of these fermented foods at home actually is because they want to improve their health. And that's also changing certain perceptions of beauty, right? So they ask themselves, maybe that's a place that we can play a role in. Should we go into foods? Should we go into beverages, for instance? And we tried to translate a lot of those maps also into something we call strategic compasses, which is very simple visualizations of what are the areas, what are our key bets, because you can see hundreds and hundreds of these interesting signals of change and interesting things, interesting trends. But of course, there's a lot of volume in that, so we need to simplify that. And this is an example of one of the compasses that we did with them, which was visualizing their 3 main pillars of investment. So they wanted to focus on identity, connecting, and digital technologies and things like that. And within that, there are a lot of interesting themes, so interesting areas that they were keeping an eye on with different urgencies. Some of them were urgent now, some of them were more important maybe in 5 to 10 years. And the value of this thing, this one we did before the pandemic, is that after a big event like the pandemic or like a financial crisis, you can review this and you can say, okay, how does it look like now? Something that we thought maybe was relevant in 10 years actually became really relevant now. And we're not trying to make a prediction, but we're just trying to be aware, to cultivate that awareness. And right now in our own tools, we're actually playing with the idea of actually creating a landscape. So this, you could see are different themes that are organized based on relevance. What's more hype now, or what's more relevant for our organization. So it actually gives us a sense of what are these things emerging in our landscape that we should identify: potential threats, potential uncertainties, potential risks, but also potential opportunities. Maybe places where we haven't played a role before, places that we haven't discovered that we should potentially look into. And the last principle that I wanted to share with you is the idea of using futures thinking and foresight more than as a process that you do once in a year for our strategy development, more as a leadership skill, as a leadership mindset. Because at the end of the day, foresight only matters when it helps you shape decisions. Otherwise, it's a really nice exercise. Everybody likes to think about the future and imagine flying cars and things like that. But if it doesn't shape your decision-making processes, it's not that useful. And we like to say that it's not an information problem, especially today, because we have so much access to that. It's more of a leadership problem. It's more about how do we translate, when we identify a problem, a potential opportunity space, into an action, into an actual action. And we like to work with this model sometimes that actually illustrate how complex it is to lead today. So first you need to understand how are you leading yourself in this context, how are you feeling yourself as a leader comfortable in a world that is constantly changing. Then you need to understand how do you lead others, how do you relate to other people. Then how are you leading technology? So technology is actually becoming also something that we need to lead, that we need to understand how we're going to use, how we're going to lead ideas. That's the creative dimension. And it's also a systemic dimension that's more how do we lead change? What's the value that we want to create as an organization or in the world or in our society, right? So leading today is extremely complex because all of these levels actually have different kinds of strategies and kind of different mindsets that we need to use. And the other aspect is that something that I've seen a lot is that we can do a lot of these studies and research is that at the end of the day, in the boardroom, a lot of decisions are made based on intuition. It's gut feeling, it's the people that has had a certain experience. And that's a good thing. I mean, like intuition is just accumulated experience. So the more you know, the more exposed you are to new ideas, to new things, the bigger your intuition is, right? And the more sensitive people, the good people with good intuition is really sensitive to some of these things, right? So foresight doesn't really need to replace intuition. It should fit it, right? So being exposed to these new ideas once a year, every 6 months, or every quarter, actually fits your intuition, and hopefully it will help you to develop that, your gut feeling. And also hopefully will help you enable better dialogue in your organizations. A lot of good strategy actually happens when there's good dialogue, when there's good conversations. And then when we have a common truth and a common ground to have those conversations, we can actually enable really meaningful dialogue instead of trying to figure out what's true or what's not. And just to close with the example of that Japanese company that I was sharing with you, this is a lot of the different layers of knowledge that we had, a lot of insights, a lot of signals, a lot of interesting opportunity spaces for investment. But we try to really take that away from the reports and activate it. So facilitating a lot of conversations, spaces for people to discuss, all their leadership groups. They could, dig deeper into these insights and actually have a space where they could talk and align and explore, okay, where can we go here? So they have, for example, they have decided to, go into hospitality right now because they see that that's also a way of fulfilling their vision of helping people experience, better beauty experiences. They also decided to go into more biohacking because that's something that, beauty brands usually haven't really touched upon, or even aesthetics, right? So they are one of the biggest donors and art purchasing organizations in Japan. Now they're buying a lot of art, they're supporting a lot of museums, and has nothing to do with cosmetics, but it's living up their vision, right? And they're doing different kinds of investments and efforts in these 3 different pillars based on some of these conversations that are, of course, constantly changing. So just to close, the opposite of uncertainty is not necessarily certainty, it's actually possibility, right? So in uncertain times, it's actually the best time to find the best potential opportunities. And processes like this can be really, really helpful to use uncertainty as an asset. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take some questions afterwards, or if you want to have a chat, or you have any questions around this and this methodology. So thank you very much for listening.